I'm 30 years old. I stood in the doorway of my parents' dining room holding a store-bought pumpkin pie, the same doorway I'd walked through every Thanksgiving since I was a little girl, and I already knew this year would be different because I could feel it in the air before I even sat down. The table was set with my mother's good china, the one she only brought out twice a year, and every chair was already filled except mine. My sister Whitney sat at the head of the table like she always did now, her white coat blazer draped over the back of her chair even though we weren't at the hospital because she liked people to know she was a doctor before she even opened her mouth. I set the pie down on the counter and slid into the last empty seat next to my Uncle Roland, who gave me a quick nod and went back to his phone. 14 people were crammed into that dining room that night, aunts, uncles, cousins, my parents, Whitney, her fiancé, and me, and I remember counting them because counting things was easier than feeling things. My mother stood up with her wine glass in hand, tapping it gently with a fork the way she always did before a toast, and the room quieted down the way it always did for her. She smiled the proud smile she reserved only for Whitney, and she raised her glass and said the words that I will never forget as long as I live. "One daughter is a doctor," she said, looking at Whitney with tears practically forming in her eyes. "The other is a maid." Then she laughed, an actual laugh light and easy, like she just told the funniest joke in the world, and the table laughed with her. 14 people laughed with her. I felt my face go hot, but I didn't say anything. I just sat there gripping my napkin under the table while my aunt patted my mother's arm and said something like, "Well, someone has to clean the houses," and another cousin snorted into his mashed potatoes. My mother didn't correct herself. She didn't apologize. She just kept going, launching into a story about how proud she was of Whitney's residency program, how Whitney had always been the smart one. How Whitney was going to change the world one patient at a time. Nobody mentioned that I ran my own house cleaning company, that I had 4 employees on payroll, that I had bought my own townhouse at 26 without a dime of help from anyone in that room. To my mother, I wasn't a business owner. I was just the maid. I sat through dinner in silence, pushing food around my plate, listening to Whitney talk about her rotations while my father nodded along like every word out of her mouth was gospel. Every few minutes I would catch my mother glancing at me, almost like she was waiting for me to laugh along, too, to prove that I could take a joke, that I wasn't too sensitive the way she always accused me of being whenever the truth stung. I forced a smile because that's what I had always done. That's what I had done my whole life at that table. Dessert came and went, and I thought maybe the worst of it was over. But then my mother stood up again, glass in hand, and I felt my stomach drop before she even said a word. She wanted to toast Whitney again. A second toast, as if the first hadn't been enough, as if the room needed another reminder of exactly where I ranked in this family. She began the same way, praising Whitney's intelligence, her dedication, her sacrifice, and I watched Whitney's fiancé beam with pride like he'd married into royalty. My father raised his glass along with everyone else, ready to drink to my sister's greatness for the second time that night, while I sat there invisible, exactly the way my mother had always made sure I felt. But this time something in me shifted. Maybe it was the second toast that did it. Or maybe 14 years of being called too sensitive for wanting basic respect had finally reached its limit that night at that table. My hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore. My mother lifted her glass higher, opening her mouth to continue her second toast to Whitney, the room falling silent in anticipation of her words. Everyone's eyes fixed on her the way they always were. And that's when I stood up. I didn't plan what I was about to say. I didn't rehearse it in my head the way I usually rehearsed every interaction with my family before I walked through their door. I just stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, and every single head at that table turned toward me instead of my mother for the first time all night. My mother froze mid-sentence, her glass still raised, her mouth slightly open, waiting to see what her maid daughter could possibly have to say that would interrupt her moment. I looked her dead in the eye, and I said the words that I had swallowed for 30 years. I looked her dead in the eye, and I said the words that I had swallowed for 30 years. "You can keep toasting Whitney all night if you want," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "but you don't get to call me a maid at my own family's table, and then act surprised when I stop showing up to it." The room went dead silent. Not the polite, awkward silence of a joke that wrong, but the kind of silence where you can hear the refrigerator humming in the next room. My mother's glass was still raised in the air, frozen there like she'd forgotten she was holding it. Whitney's fiancé stopped mid-chew. Even my Uncle Roland put his phone down. My mother blinked at me like I had spoken in a language she didn't recognize. "Jasmine, it was a joke," she said, forcing a laugh that came out thin and brittle. "Don't be so sensitive." There it was, the phrase I had heard my entire life, the phrase that had always worked before, the one that used to make me sit back down and apologize for having feelings in the first place. But not this time. "It wasn't a joke," I said. "You've called me the maid in front of this family for years, and everyone just laughs because you laugh first. I clean houses for a living, Mom, and I built that business myself. I have 4 employees on payroll. I bought my own home at 26 without help from your dad. But to you, none of that matters because I'm not wearing a white coat." My father cleared his throat and mumbled something about how I was overreacting, and that's when I turned to him, too. "You raised your glass right along with her," I said. "Both toasts. You didn't say a word either time." He looked down at his plate like it had suddenly become the most interesting object in the room. My aunt tried to smooth things over, saying something about how families tease each other and I shouldn't take so personally, but I didn't back down. "There's a difference between teasing and humiliating someone in front of 14 people, I said. You all laughed. Every single one of you laughed. Nobody had an answer for that. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. 14 people who had been laughing minutes earlier now staring at their plates, their napkins, anywhere but at me or my mother. Whitney, to her credit, looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time all night. She set down her fork and said quietly, "Mom, she's right. That wasn't okay." My mother's head snapped toward her, shocked, like she hadn't expected her golden child to break rank. "I love that you're proud of me," Whitney continued, "but you've done this before and it's not fair to Jasmine." My mother's face went through about 4 different expressions in the span of 5 seconds, landing somewhere between embarrassment and defensiveness. "I didn't mean it like that," she said quietly, but the joke had already been told. The laugh had already happened, and you can't unsay something that 14 people heard and laughed at. I didn't yell. I didn't cry, though my eyes were burning. I just picked up my purse from the back of my chair and said, "I love this family, but I'm not going to keep sitting at a table where I'm the punchline every year. When you're ready to introduce me as your daughter instead of the maid, you know where to find me." Then I walked out of that dining room, out of that house, and into the cold November air, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could actually breathe. My phone started buzzing before I even got to my car. Texts from cousins I hadn't spoken to in months saying they'd always felt uncomfortable with how my mother talked about me but never knew how to say anything. A voice memo from my aunt apologizing for laughing along, admitting she felt sick about it the moment I walked out. Even Whitney called me that night, not to defend our mother but to tell me she was proud of me for finally saying something and that she planned on having a serious conversation with our parents about the way they had treated me for years. My mother called 3 days later. She didn't apologize right away, but she asked if we could really talk about what had been happening at every holiday for years. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were more hard conversations after that one, more moments where old habits crept back in, but something had shifted permanently the moment I stood up from that table. I stopped being the family's quiet punching bag and slowly I started becoming someone they had to actually reckon with instead of laugh at. If you've ever sat at a table where your own family made you feel small, I want you to know that speaking up doesn't make you dramatic. It makes you free. If this story moved you the way it moved me to tell it, Hit that subscribe button right now because these are the stories that need to be heard and there are so many more coming. Subscribe and let's make sure nobody ever has to sit in silence at their own family's table again.